The word depression gets used in two quite different ways. Casually, to describe a period of low mood or disappointment. I was so depressed when the film ended. And clinically, to describe a specific diagnosable mental health condition with a distinct set of features, causes, and treatments. Understanding the difference matters because conflating the two creates confusion about what depression requires and who deserves help. Clinical depression, more formally called major depressive disorder or MDD, is characterized by persistent low mood or loss of interest and pleasure in activities, present nearly every day for at least 2 weeks, alongside a cluster of other symptoms, including changes in sleep, appetite, energy, concentration, and self-worth. It is not a proportionate response to difficult circumstances. It is not a personality trait, a weakness, or a choice. It is a medical condition with measurable neurological, neurochemical, and physical correlates. What sets depression apart from ordinary low mood is its duration, its pervasiveness, and its functional impact. Ordinary sadness and disappointment are responsive. They ease when circumstances change, when enough time passes, when we receive comfort or support. Depression is less responsive, persisting even when circumstances improve and resisting attempts to reason or talk your way out of it. This is one of the reasons Just Think Positive is so unhelpful as advice for someone who is clinically depressed. It addresses ordinary low mood, not the condition it's actually being offered to. It's also worth noting that depression exists on a spectrum. At the less severe end is persistent depressive disorder, formerly called dysthymia, a chronic lower-level depression that persists for years without necessarily reaching the intensity of a full depressive episode, but which carries its own significant burden. At more severe ends, depression can involve psychotic features, catatonia, or episodes of such severity that hospitalization is required. Understanding that depression has range, that it doesn't have to be the most dramatic presentation to be real and worth treating, is one of the key realizations that gets people help earlier. For much of the 20th century, depression was understood primarily through the monoamine hypothesis, the idea that depression was caused by insufficient levels of neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine in the brain. This model led to the development of antidepressants that target these systems. And while those medications work for many people, the monoamine model turns out to be significantly oversimplified. Current neuroscience understands depression as involving multiple interacting systems rather than a single chemical deficiency. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactive in depression, generating an exaggerated response to negative stimuli and a blunted response to positive ones. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, emotional regulation, and executive function, shows reduced activity and connectivity with the amygdala, which means the brain's capacity to regulate its own emotional responses is compromised. The hippocampus, involved in memory and stress regulation, can actually reduce in volume during prolonged depressive episodes due to the effects of chronic cortisol elevation, though this is reversible with treatment. The default mode network, a set of brain regions active when we're not focused on a specific task, becomes hyperactive in depression, generating the kind of self-referential, ruminative thinking that is so characteristic of the condition. This is why depression makes it so hard to simply stop thinking. The brain's resting activity has itself become the problem. Perhaps most importantly for understanding treatment, researchers have discovered that antidepressants and psychotherapy both produce neurological changes. They increase neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections, promote neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, and gradually shift the balance of activity across these systems. Recovery from depression is not just psychological, it is literally a process of neurological reorganization, which is why it takes time and why early intervention produces better outcomes. Depression is not only a brain condition, it is a whole-body experience with measurable physical correlates that are often as debilitating as the psychological symptoms, and which mainstream accounts of depression frequently underemphasize. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, is chronically elevated in many people with depression. This has wide-ranging effects. It disrupts sleep architecture, particularly the balance between REM and non-REM sleep, suppresses immune function, which is why people with depression are more susceptible to infections, raises inflammation markers throughout the body, and affects digestion and gut microbiome health. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication system between the gut and the brain, is increasingly understood to play a significant role in mood regulation, with research suggesting that gut microbiome composition influences neurochemistry in ways that affect depression risk and severity. Physical symptoms commonly associated with depression include chronic fatigue that doesn't respond to rest, diffuse pain and muscle aches, headaches, digestive issues, changes in appetite and weight, and a heightened sensitivity to physical discomfort. Many people with depression present first to their GP with physical symptoms: persistent tiredness, pain of unclear origin, digestive complaints, without the depression itself being identified, sometimes for years. This bidirectionality matters for treatment. Addressing only the psychological dimensions of depression while ignoring the body's contribution, particularly sleep, movement, nutrition, and inflammation, leaves the treatment incomplete. The evidence base for exercise in depression, for example, is substantially stronger than most people realize. Regular aerobic exercise produces comparable effects to antidepressants in mild to moderate depression, not through sheer willpower, but through the same neurological pathways those medications target, including neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. The body is not separate from the depressed brain. It is part of the system that needs to heal. Clinical accounts of depression describe symptoms and criteria. They are less good at capturing what depression actually feels like to live inside. And because depression impairs the ability to communicate precisely, cognition is affected, words feel harder to find, emotional numbness can make even distress feel remote and hard to articulate. People with depression often struggle to convey the experience to those who haven't had it. Some consistent features emerge from accounts and research. The first is a pervasive loss of motivation and pleasure, what clinicians call anhedonia, which is often described not as sadness but as flatness or greyness, or the absence of colour where colour used to be. Things that used to matter don't. Things that used to be enjoyable are inert. Not unpleasant, just not anything. This is one of the most disorienting aspects of depression, because it removes the very internal compass that would ordinarily orient you toward what's worth doing. A second is a kind of cognitive slowing. Thinking feels effortful, concentration is fragmented, decision-making becomes disproportionately difficult. Simple choices feel overwhelming, not because the stakes are high, but because the processing required has become costly. This cognitive dimension of depression is often what most affects daily functioning, particularly work performance and interpersonal communication. A third is the sense of heaviness, a physical and psychic weight that makes ordinary activity feel laborious. Getting out of bed, showering, making a phone call, these carry a cost in a depressive state that bears no relation to their objective difficulty. From the outside, this can look like laziness or lack of effort. From the inside, it is an enormous expenditure of will to do things that, in another state, would require none. And a fourth is the temporal distortion. Depression tends to flatten the sense of future. The ability to imagine that things could be different, that this will pass, that there is something on the other side of this period, all of this is compromised by the condition itself. This is the mechanism by which depression produces hopelessness, not through clear-eyed assessment of the facts, but through a neurological impairment of the imagination. Depression does not present identically in everyone, and understanding its variability is important both for recognition and for reducing stigma around who gets to call what they're experiencing depression. In men, depression frequently presents differently from the classical profile: less visible sadness and more irritability, anger, risk-taking behavior, increased alcohol or substance use, and a tendency to work harder or withdraw into activity rather than showing the expected withdrawal and flatness. This means depression in men is chronically underdiagnosed. Men are less likely to seek help, less likely to describe their symptoms in the language the diagnostic system expects, and often less likely to be asked. The suicide statistics reflect this. In the UK, men account for approximately 3/4 of all suicide deaths, a disparity driven in large part by undertreated depression. In young people, depression often presents with irritability, school refusal, social withdrawal, and increased sensitivity to perceived rejection, features that can easily be misread as typical teenage behavior and left unaddressed for years. People from marginalized communities, including Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities in the UK, face additional barriers to depression diagnosis and treatment, including cultural stigma, mistrust of mental health systems rooted in historical experience, and the compound burden of discrimination itself, which is both a risk factor for depression and a barrier to accessing the environments where help is available. High-functioning depression, also known as persistent depressive disorder at its clinical end, is perhaps the most commonly overlooked presentation of all. People with high-functioning depression maintain outward functionality. They go to work, meet responsibilities, and appear to be managing. Underneath the surface, they are living in a chronic, low-grade depressive state that has been present for so long it can feel like simply their personality, rather than a condition that is separate from who they are and that responds to treatment. Depression is one of the most treatable conditions in mental health. This bears repeating because the hopelessness that depression itself generates tends to obscure it. The majority of people who receive appropriate treatment for depression experience significant improvement, and many recover fully. The evidence base is clearest for two broad approaches: psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and its derivatives, as well as interpersonal therapy, IPT, and behavioral activation, produces lasting changes in both symptom severity and neurological function. CBT works by targeting the patterns of thought and behavior that maintain depression, not by positive thinking, but by systematically examining the accuracy of depressive cognitions and experimenting with different behavioral choices. Behavioral activation, one of the most straightforward and effective approaches for depression, works by gradually increasing engagement with activities that provide a sense of accomplishment or pleasure, not because the motivation to do them exists first, but because acting creates the neurological conditions for motivation to return. Antidepressant medications are effective for moderate to severe depression, and the evidence for their use, particularly SSRIs and SNRIs, is robust. They do not work for everyone, and finding the right medication can require trying more than one. They take several weeks to reach full effect. They are not a permanent dependency for most people, Many individuals take antidepressants for 6 to 12 months and then discontinue them without relapse, particularly when combined with psychotherapy. Beyond formal treatment, the lifestyle factors with the strongest evidence base for depression include regular aerobic exercise, 3 to 5 sessions per week at moderate intensity, sleep hygiene, consistent sleep-wake times, reduced light and screen exposure before bed, dietary quality, particularly anti-inflammatory foods and adequate omega-3 intake, and social connection, even minimal, low-effort connection. What consistently doesn't help is pure willpower, positive thinking, waiting for it to pass, and self-criticism. None of these address the neurological basis of the condition. Getting help early, before episodes become entrenched, consistently produces better outcomes than waiting until the situation is severe enough to feel earned.